welcome dear students. Today our topic for deliberation is Beyond Varnas, Subordination and Conflict. Before going through this lecture, first let me explain its main objectives. Number 1, to know about the rights of women. Number 2, to know about the various views on property rights and the relation of women. Number 3, to know about the impact of Buddhism on the position of women. And finally, to know about the projection of women in the Dharma Shastra texts. While the Brahmanas believed some people to be outside the system, they also created a more pronounced social barriers by categorizing certain social groups as untouchables. This was based on the belief that certain activities, particularly those associated with the conduct of rites, were sacred and therefore pure. Individuals who considered themselves pure refrained from eating with those they deemed untouchable. In stark contrast to the elements of purity, certain actions were deemed particularly polluting. These included dealing with dead bodies and animals. These individuals, known as the Chandalas, were positioned at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Those who claimed to be at the top of the social hierarchy viewed their touch and, in some circumstances, their mere presence as polluting. The Manusmriti established the duties of Chandalas. They were required to reside outside the village, utilize discarded utensils, and wear the clothes of a dead and iron ornaments. They were unable to roam villages and cities at night. They were required to dispose of the bodies of people with no surviving family members and functions as executioners. Much later, the Chinese Buddhist monk Fahin, around 5th century CE, penned that untouchables were required to use as clipper so that people would avoid seeing them. Another Chinese scholar, Zhuangzang, about 7th century, noted that executioners and scavengers were required to reside outside the city. By analyzing the non-Brahmanical texts depicting the lives of the Chandalas, historians have attempted to determine whether Chandalas accepted the Shastric prescribed life of derogation. Sometimes these depictions match those in the Brahmanical writings. Occasionally, however, there are clues of different social realities. Dear students, let's discuss women in Dharma Shastra and Puranic eras. During the age of Dharma Shastras and Puranas, women's position rapidly decreased and suffered a significant transformation. They lacked access to formal education. Daughters were considered inferior than the sons. The liberty of women was restricted. Sons were accorded greater significance than daughters. It was forbidden for women to study the Vedas and become brahmacharis. Manu, the lawgiver of ancient India, states that the women must be subordinate to their father throughout her childhood, their husband during adolescence, and their sons in the old age. At no point shall she be granted her freedom. However, he counterbalanced this by stating that in a society in which women were not respected would be condemned. Due to the numerous limits placed on the freedom of women, difficulties began to emerge. In the social sphere, pre-puberty marriage came to be practiced. Widower marriage was outlawed. The husband was elevated to the role of God for a woman. The customs of sati gained popularity, and the practices of polygamy was accepted. A woman was denied any right to her husband's property on the grounds that a wife and slave can't own property. In the realm of religion, she was prohibited from offering sacrifices and prayers, performing penance, and making pilgrimages. Now, dear students, let's discuss women in Buddhist era. The status of women increased marginally during the Buddhist era, but there was no significant shift. Some constraints and rigidities imposed by the caste system were relaxed. Buddha advocated equality and sought to elevate the cultural, educational, and the religious position of women. During the benevolent role of great Buddhist monarchs such as Chandragupta Maurya, Ashoka, and others, women regained a part of their lost independence and prestige as a result of liberal Buddhist philosophy. Women might pursue vocations in education in addition to domestic labor. In the realm of religion, women attained a position of primacy. It was permissible for women to become sannyasi. Women had their own sanghas known as Bhikshuni Sangha, which was governed by the same rules and regulations as the monk sanghas. The sangha provided them with numerous opportunities for cultural activities, social services, and public life. However, their political and economic position remained constant. Now, dear students, let us discuss the property relations. In different regions of the subcontinent, slaves, landless agricultural laborers, hunters, fisherfolk, pastoralists, peasant village headmen, artisans, merchants, and kings arose as social actors as a result of the economic relations outlined in early sections. Their social status was frequently determined by their access to economic resources. In this section, we will investigate the social implications of resource access in certain contexts. Now students, let us discuss gender access to property. Considered first a pivotal point from the Mahabharata, Duryodhana summoned Yudhishthira to a game of dice during the prolonged conflict between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. The latter, having been tricked by his opponent, gambled his gold, elephants, chariots, slaves, army, treasury, kingdom, the property of his subjects, his brothers, and ultimately himself, and lost everything. Then he gambled their common wife Draupadi and lost her. In addition to Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, stories such as this one also addressed issues of ownership. According to Manusmriti, after the death of the parents, the paternal estate was to be divided equally among the sons, with a particular allotment for the eldest. Women were denied access to these resources. However, women were permitted to keep the presents they received on their wedding day as Satridhana, which means woman's riches. Their children might inherit this without the husband having any claim to it. In fact, the Manusmriti cautioned women against hoarding family property or even their own assets without the consent of her husbands. However, accumulated epigraphic and textual evidences suggest that the upper class woman may have had access to resources. Men generally controlled land, cattle, and money. In other words, inequalities in access to resources increased the social differences between the men and women. Now, dear students, let's throw some light upon the Varna and access to property. According to the Brahmanical scriptures, Varna was an alternative criterion for regulating access to wealth. However, the only employment specified for Shudras was servitude. But males of the other three Varnas were permitted a range of activities. If these conditions were actually fulfilled, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas would have been the wealthiest persons. It is obvious from the accounts of the priestess and the monarchs in other textual traditions that this accorded with social realities to some extent. Almost always, kings are shown as wealthy. Priests are likewise typically depicted as wealthy, but the Brahmana is occasionally depicted as poor. While the Brahmanical perspective of society was being formalized in Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, other traditions were developing critiques of the Varna system. Some of the most well-known were developed in the early Buddhism, that is 6th century BCE. Buddhists acknowledged the existence of societal distinctions, but did not view them as natural or fixed. Moreover, they rejected claims to status based on birth. Now students, let's throw some light on different social scenarios, wealth sharing. So far we have examined scenarios in which individuals claimed or were assigned status based on their wealth. However, there were also cases in which men who were generous and were admired and those who were miserly, who just collected fortunes for their own benefit, were condemned. In ancient Tamil Ikkam, there were multiple chiefdoms roughly 2000 years ago, was one region where these ideas were cherished. Chiefs were supporters of bards and the poets who sung their praise among the other things. Poems featured in the analogies of the Tamil Sangam frequently illuminate social and economic relations, demonstrating that while there were differences between the rich and the poor, those who owned resources were also expected to share them. Now students, let's discuss about the property rights of women. In Indian tradition, the legal right of women to inherit property has been restricted since ancient times. In the historical text, Manu Smriti, Manu states, her father protects her in childhood, her husband protects her in youth, and her sons protect her in old age. A woman is never fit for independence. However, women were not always prohibited from inheriting movable or immovable property from their ancestors and partners. However, their share of the property was far less than that of their male counterparts. Restrictions on the Hindu woman property rights have evolved over times. Patriarchal Hindu society provided women with property referred to as Sitradhan, which derived mostly from marriage presents in shape of cloths, jewelry, and in some rare cases, landed properties. However, women were denied property rights to ancestral or marital landed property, and they had restricted succession rights over landed family property. With the establishment of various schools of Hindu law, the notion of Sitradhan began to acquire a broader literal and legal meaning, providing women more rights to some forms of property. The Sanskrit states, Nasatri Vatantra Mitraha Suvantram Nakhishti Sitraha, implies that the women were unsuited for independent living in ancient Hindu society. A woman was regarded as subhuman, an object to be protected by her male guardians. Even though the Puranas, mythological tales passed down from the time of Krishna, described goddess as Shakti, which was a goddess of universal power, Mahalakshmi, goddess of wealth, and Mahasaraswati, goddess of knowledge. Mortal women were placed below the status of Shudra, the lowest Varna of Hindu society. Ancient texts never mention an unmarried woman ownership of property. Upon marriage, however, a woman was permitted to possess a limited range of property known as Sitradhan, which includes movable items such as jewelry, clothing, utensils, and livestock. In rare instances, immovable property such as land was also given as Sitradhan. A woman was never the sole owner of her Sitradhan, as the Manu Smriti says that a wife and her property belonged to her husband. The term Sitradhan was never clearly defined in these ancient sources. Neither its qualities nor the succession rule was specified. However, this began to change with the formation of various schools of Hindu law. Now, dear students, let's focus upon the formation of various Hindu schools of law. According to the ancient Hindu mythology, the foundational books of Hindu religion, that is, the Rig Veda, the Arthaveda, the Samveda, and the Yajurveda. Numerous Smritis and the Shrutis, non-revealed and revealed respectively, were added to the Vedic literature by ancient Hindu sages, many of which dealt explicitly with property concerned and the women property rights. During the time when these comments on the Smriti and the Shruti were being composed, several schools of thought formed in various parts of the Indian subcontinent, and these schools established a number of marriage and inheritance norms and the principles. Mitkasara and the Dayabhaga were the two most significant schools, each based on the distinct interpretations of Yajnavalkya Smriti, which was composed by the sage Yajnavalkya, and is one of the three principal Smritis of ancient India and the second most important source of Hindu law after Manu Smriti. The Mitkasara school is founded on sage Vignasara's interpretation of Yajnavalkya's texts, whereas the Dayabhaga school is founded on a sage Jambutavahan's commentary. In India, inheritance law continued to be guided by the laws established by these schools. The Mitkasara school is subdivided into 4 schools based on geographic regions, namely the Dravida, Maharashtra, Banaras and Mithila schools. The Mitkasara school was followed across India with the exception of the eastern region. The Mitkasara school is characterized by 3 characteristics: the significance of blood relationship in inheritance problems, the constraints placed on co-partners part of the joint family property, and the differentiation between male and the female heirs. Concerning the second issue, the Mitkasara school asserted that a co-partner share in the joint family property is not absolute and fluctuates constantly due to the birth and the death of other co-partners. Therefore, co-partners lack the absolute right to transfer their shares. As for the third issue, the Mitkasara school held that a woman could never become a co-partner and that the widow of a deceased co-partner could not demand the partition of her deceased husband's share against his brothers. Consequently, Hindu women property rights were severely curtailed according to this school of thought. The Dayabhaga school, the second most significant school of law after Mitkasara, was followed mostly in the eastern section of the country, particularly in the province of Bengal and Assam, and has no sub-schools. It differs from the Mitkasara school regarding inheritance rules and the status of female heirs. The Dayabhaga school asserts the right to inherit arises from spiritual offerings to deceased ancestors. The right over the Hindu joint family property devolves to the heir on the death of the father and not by the birth, as was maintained by the Mitkasara school. For heirs of joint family property, each share is different, and each brother can sell his particular fraction of the share, and if there are no male descendants, a widow has the right to succeed her deceased husband's property. On the subject of a woman's status as a property owner, the Dayabhaga school differed significantly from the Mitkasara school. Nonetheless, this more liberal strategy had clearly defined boundaries. For example, women were not absolute owners of the property inherited from their male ancestors, since they could only sell it for certain legal purposes and not for other reasons. On the death of a woman without sons, the property passed to the next male heir of the dead male owner and not her female heirs. Another distinction between the Mitkasara and the Dayabhaga school was that the Dayabhaga school's classification of women into 5 groups that determined inheritance priority. These included the wife, daughter, mother, mother of the father, and mother of the father's father. Now, dear students, let's know about the concept of Satradhan. The Mitkasara school disapproved on woman inherited property from her husband's family. As a result, a woman could only acquire Satradhan. Its legal and technical implications the Mitkasara school enlarged to 9 kinds: gifts and bequests from relatives, gifts and bequests from strangers, property acquired by self-exertion and mechanical arts, property acquired with Satradhan, property acquired by compromise, property obtained by adverse possession, property obtained in lieu of maintenance, property obtained by inheritance, and shared obtained by partition. Even though the first 7 types of Satradhan were recognized and were defined as distinct categories, the remaining 2 remained controversial until the beginning of 20th century. Thus, we can see that as time passes, the notion of Satradhan evolves into 2 distinct categories of property rights: complete ownership, which includes the right to alienation, and limited ownership, which excludes this right. The 2 primary schools of Hindu theology viewed Satradhan as the property of women. However, not all Satradhan was accessible to male claimants. Satradhan was divided into 2 types. Number 1, the Sodhakiya, which she receives as gift from relatives on both sides, parents and husbands, and which she acquired through self-efforts and mechanical art during her maidenhood and widowhood. and over which she had full disposal rights. And number second is non-sodhakiya, which included gifts from strangers and property acquired through self-effort, mechanical art, etc. As a married woman over which she had no right of alienation. Her husband was also authorized to use it. However, upon her death, all Sitridahan types would belong to her heirs. Other sources serve to complete the picture of the property rights of ancient Hindu women. The Dharma Shastra Sanskrit texts pertaining to the Hindu religious and the legal duties state that the wife of an absent manager or the widow of a deceased manager may alienate or transfer family property belonging to the numerous minors who are unable to enter into contractual relationships in their own persons, particularly in situations requiring the maintenance of dependents and the performance of various family duties. Also, supporting this right are Katyayana, Smriti Chandrika, Bhava Swamin, and Yajnavalkya Smriti. However, the Dharma Shastra states clearly that the women were only considered managers in time of crisis and never had the authority to manage property for their own interests. Furthermore, it is evident that many social religious crimes originated from ancient succession laws. A Hindu woman was never acknowledged as the sole owner of any property she acquired, particularly land. Manu believed that the women were less than males, especially in situations where a woman was the sole child. In such situations, ancient legal authorities recommended adopting a male child to care for parental property, which should never have been left in the care of a woman, regardless of her level of education. This struggle with women over property ownership spanned a number of social religious offenses that were granted legal status in the purpose of defending family wealth. For instance, when a woman could not produce a male heir, thus bigamy, remarriage for the male heir, forced sexual intercourse with another man to have a male child, female infanticide, and the wife abandonment were commonly accepted, if not officially, then in the name of religion. So dear students, that was all about today's lecture regarding Beyond Varna, subordination and conflict. Hope you have enjoyed the lecture. We shall meet again with a new topic. Till then, take care of yourself. Goodbye.